It's an honor to be here. I thank you for the invitation and for you guys suffering through not one, but two different papers. So I wrote two different papers on two different 19th century confessional movements, and they're very different in structure and point. The first one on Vilmar is very theologically stuffed, let's say. And then the second one on Clifford is very practically oriented. And so they're going to be two very different styles of papers. So I hope they're not too bad. So, why Vilmar? Or why is Vilmar worthy of our attention? I assume this is a question that you are expecting me to answer, and I will, or at least I will sketch out an answer, at least I hope to. August Friedrich Christian Vilmar was an anomaly. He was in his day respected by his students and some peers. At the same time, he was also looked down upon with contempt and disgust. But he also remains an anomaly today. Maybe a few of us here have read some of his writings. Not much has been translated into English. And maybe we like certain aspects of his theology. Maybe some parts of his high view of the office of the ministry. But there are other things about him that we probably wouldn't like, or maybe you would scratch your heads about. His Chiliasm, he's a monarchist, and he believed that getting drunk once disqualified a man from the office of the ministry. So that's a pretty high standard, but any of us don't be certain about. But what I want us to consider today is Vilmar's broader understanding of theology. This, I argue, is what made him truly an anomaly and somewhat worthy of our consideration. Amid the height of German academic theology in the 19th century, Vilmar looked strange, like a figure from a different time. However, Vilmar does not necessarily fit into any of our models of what theology is either. He was no advocate of impersonation theology. Whether we know it or not, Vilmar was also a child of his day, inspired by some of the same theological and philosophical trends that he rejected. Born in Hesse in 1800, Vilmar studied theology at the University of Marburg between 1818 and 1820. So I'll go over a brief biographical period, and I'll dive into some of his. I want to put Vilmar into conversation with his contemporaries, namely with broader German theology, his critique of it, and then his presentation of what theology is. And I think that is really, really fascinating. So, studied theology at the University of Marburg before serving as school rector at Rosenberg on the Fulda in 1824, and then he was a teacher for the gymnasium in Hirschfeld in 1827. During his time there, Vilmar was awarded an honorary doctorate in philosophy by the Philosophical Faculty of Marburg. And this is fascinating. Vilmar, although he would go on to teach theology as a university, he did not have an earned doctorate in theology. In 1833, Vilmar was appointed as director of the gymnasium in Marburg, a position he held until 1855, when he was appointed as full professor of theology at the University of Marburg, where he lectured over dogmatics, moral and pastoral theology, and also offered lectures over the practical interpretations of Scripture. According to Vilmar's own attestation, the course of his theological studies at Marburg followed the current division between rationalism and supernaturalism. During this period, Vilmar read deeply from Immanuel Kant, and by his own admission, Vilmar identified with the position of theological rationalism, dismissing the possibility of miracles, and he went as far as to reject both the Trinity and the doctrine of the two natures of Christ, as well as the doctrines of original sin and justification. Vilmar says, "The Trinity I reject as not taught in the New Testament, contrary to reason, and consequently highly pernicious to a pure faith. All speculation over it is folly." At this time, Vilmar believed that Christianity was tasked with moral instruction, and its three central teachings concerned a general non-Trinitarian teaching on God, human freedom, and the immortality of the soul. He even went as far as to write a dogmatics text at this time, but it was not published. But by 1826 and 1827, Vilmar began to move away from this theological rationalism. and he credits 4 different sources that began to help him move away. First was his reading of various early church fathers, notably Augustine, Tertullian, Ignatius, and Irenaeus. Second, Vilmar began a study of the leading theologians of Lutheran Orthodoxy, specifically Gerhard, Kelloff, and Hollis. Third, a work that had the most decisive effect on Vilmar's theological transition was a theological text by a 19th century German theologian by the name of Friedrich August Tollach on the doctrine of sin and reconciliation. And then finally, perhaps what may come as a surprise to some of us, in 1829, Vilmar wrote to his brother about the impact that Friedrich Schleiermacher's Glaubenslehre had on him, specifically where Schleiermacher located religion in the grounds of self-consciousness. By 1830, Vilmar had broken with his early rationalist position and begun a transition to a more confessional theology, defined by a strong adherence to the Lutheran confessions, even though he acknowledged at this time his development was still incomplete. The most notable example of this development was a speech that Vilmar gave on the Augustana at the 300th anniversary of the Augustana. Vilmar acknowledged that in his study of the Augsburg Confession, there was a full unlocking of everything that he had previously read in the writings of Tertullian, Augustine, and Gerhard. Moreover, Vilmar credited the Augustana for helping him again become Lutheran and rediscover the meaning of Lutheranism. Vilmar located the transformative influence of the Augustana in how it helped him to recognize and reject rationalist theology as nothing more than what he writes as a theory of rhetoric, or a theology of rhetoric. And this will become very important. He uses this term a lot, theology of rhetoric. The early church fathers, Lutheran Orthodoxy, and the Augustana offered, in contrast, a theology of Sachen, a theology of things, of something that is real, which are here recorded with the deepest feeling of truth and immediate feeling. Vilmar ascribed the rejection of his theological rationalism to the Augustana. By 1830, although his term was not yet full, Vilmar was on a developing course that would lead him to later become a staunch confessional Lutheran. Throughout the later 30s and into the 40s, his theology continued to evolve, especially in the area of ecclesiology. While no further radical turn transpired within the thought, it was not until the 1850s, after the turbulent and revolutionary years of 48 and 1849, that Vilmar's theological and political views arrived at what he would say is their mature state. By this point, Vilmar's theology had evolved from a theological rationalism to a conservative theological position, often seen as strident and uncompromising in its adherence to the Lutheran confessions. Moreover, his Lutheran turn coincided not only with his rejection of theological rationalism, but also with his wholesale denunciation of modern theology, specifically in one aspect, and this is what I'm going to focus on now for a while: modern theological science, or modern theological, in German, Wissenschaft. If you remember in your reading of Pieper in volume 1 has a long section, maybe not long, maybe 10, 20 pages, on the question, is theology a science? Is theology a Wissenschaft? And this is because in the 19th century, as I'll talk about in a moment, this was the center, one of the central defining questions of the day. Is theology Wissenschaft? What makes Vilmar stand out from his peers is that he positioned himself in opposition to the 19th century culture of science. Since the time of Kant, German intellectual culture had become obsessed with the idea of Wissenschaft and the need to make all intellectual pursuits, especially those that would be housed in the university, a science. Some might want to interpret Vilmar's rejection of contemporary university theology as the ramblings of some old disgruntled parish pastor ranting and raving from his parish in the country. But this was not Vilmar. Vilmar was a university professor. His appointment to the University of Marburg is the backdrop for understanding his first major theological writing, perhaps the only one that we've read, wherein he denounces modern theology. When he received his call to the university, Vilmar published his infamous De Theologie der Tatsachen wider die Theologie der Rhetorik. So the theology of facts, as it's translated, against the theology of rhetoric. This was a programmatic essay for his forthcoming professorship at the university. In this writing, Vilmar sketched out a brief outline in introduction to what he believed constituted the center of theological study and its overarching structure that houses this center. Unlike other introductory texts, Vilmar did not intend for this writing to function as what was called a theological encyclopedia, which was an encyclopedia of the entire corpus of what theological studies were. These had become very popular at the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. Some were translated into English, and it's very possible that there was some taught at the Old Concordia back in the day as well. Vilmar instead constructed this essay as the personal ruminations of a freshly appointed professor who was standing before the theological lector, considering the task of academic theology. From this vantage point, Vilmar condemned his former theological studies for providing him no food for life, no nourishment for life, but instead only teaching him a certainty of nothing. His theological instruction was little more than, he said, page-turning and uncertain words. But since his days in the classroom, and as a young theologian, he had learned a different theology, and he had learned that theology possessed a different certainty. And so he asked himself this question: are you in position to teach a theology which consists not merely of words, formulae, schemata, someday not to be put off and discussed? Are you in the evening of life, set in this teaching spot? Are you in position to teach a theology which gives you once vainly sought on long detours and wrong paths, and actually found, but not in or through academic theology? Are you in position to teach a theology of undoubted divine certainty for the care of souls and for the food of eternal life, food given to those who hear, so that they can bring the same certainty, the same bread of life to the souls one day to be entrusted to them? The theology of facts was Vilmar's clarion call to the theological community to abandon the current path of academic theology, a path he believed led only to theology's death, and a return to theology's only possible living course. To make his case more pointed and on the nose, Vilmar constructed his argument by exposing the apparent vacuous theology of his day with what I said is this title, Theology of Rhetoric. Throughout this writing, Vilmar castigated contemporary academic theology for numerous deficiencies. But while Vilmar was able to lambast the current theological institution for specific shortcomings, such as an insufficient ecclesiology or its failure to maintain a place for theology of the church discipline, his antagonism was based on a more fundamental characteristic feature of modern theology, and that is this point: theology as a science. From his perspective, this phenomena of scientization had captivated the German intellectual community, and it resulted in a wholesale disciplinary mischaracterization of what theology is. Technically, the problem itself was not that theology or any other discipline understood itself as a science. Vilmar was aware of the long tradition that went back at least into Aquinas, where theology was considered a science. In fact, the queen of the sciences. Theology's scientific classification had only become problematic within the modern era as the definition of science itself underwent a transformation. Whereas science formerly meant, according to Vilmar, nothing other than episteme or doctrina, presently the reference of its semantic field fell completely within the realm of, and this is key, the natural sciences, which is what we understand science to be now. When we use the word science in an Anglophone context, we mean the natural sciences, the hard sciences. From Vilmar's perspective, the redefinition of science had disastrous consequences in its theological application. In order to maintain its status as a science, and so, by doing that, to retain its spot at the university, theology became subject to foreign practices and methodologies of the natural sciences, specifically science is based just on empirical observation, resulting in a transformation, deformation, and ultimately disintegration of theology. Vilmar writes, to apply this concept of science in every respect to theology is the affair of a theology. Not a theology, but a theology. Anti-theology. That is the theology of dialectic and natural science, the theology of apostasy. The result can only be that in the total and consistent application of this concept of science, theology is dissolved for whoever makes use of it. According to Vilmar, the modernization of theology through the appropriation of the tenets of modern science, the engine that drove all of contemporary German theology, was untenable. Unlike one of his earlier teachers, or earlier German theological figure Schleiermacher, Vilmar did not see the possibility of establishing a covenant of peace between theology and science. Schleiermacher feared that if theology refused to reform itself according to the advances of modern science, the outcome would be a cultural disaster and an irreparable division between a barbaric, unscientific Christianity and an incredulous and unchristian community of scientists. To Vilmar's dismay, the attempt to circumvent the identification of Christianity with barbarism and science with unbelief led to the decoupling of theology and faith, and the creation of a theology of unbelief. In Vilmar's estimation, theology's appropriation of the understanding of science was the Trojan horse that allowed the natural sciences to breach theology's disciplinary wall. In the desire to maintain and defend theology's status as a university science, theologians unquestionably reconfigured theology as a modern science. The goal of establishing theology as a science, for Vilmar, resulted in errors that led to theology's demise. And I'll focus on one. Within natural sciences, it was now commonplace on behalf of the sciences to assume a posture of a methodological impartiality. In other words, the observer had to adopt an attitude devoid of presuppositions, for Aussetzungslosigkeit. Only through the maintenance of a mentality absent of all presuppositions was the scientist able to come to know the object of its inquiry. The scientist came to know the object of its study in a piecemeal fashion through an amalgamation of observations and inferences. But this methodology, with its attendant mental disposition on the scientist's part, while congruent with the natural sciences, Vilmar says this is perfectly fine for the natural sciences. It's completely antithetical to theology. Vilmar believed that theology's adoption of a methodology, attempting to maintain a mental posture absent of all presuppositions, resulted in theology's own demise. He writes, the atheologians have taken over this impartiality and absence of presuppositions into their system with great applause, and rightly so, since it achieves their purpose with undoubted certainty, that is, the destruction of theology, the annihilation of faith, the setting of enmity against Christ, the renunciation of God and one's own soul in need of and fit for redemption. I'll bracket this for a second. So Vilmar here brings up the very famous David Friedrich Strauss, who wrote the critical Das Leben Jesu. In the introduction, if you haven't read it, Strauss brings up his opponents who are bringing accusations against him. And he says, my opponents write that my lack of faith disqualifies me as a theologian. And he says, it's actually their faith which disqualifies them as a theologian. My lack of faith makes me a better theologian. So this is not an abstraction that Vilmar is taking against. These are, now granted, Strauss was a very controversial figure, but that idea of presuppositionless theology had infected the major German institutions of his time. The goal of removing all theological presuppositions from the mind of the theologian was a direct affront to the task of theology. For Vilmar, theology concerned eternal salvation, and this demanded that one not begin with impartiality and the absence of presuppositions, but rather is biased in favor of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and assumes an eternal salvation won by the Savior on the cross. Vilmar maintained that contemporary theological science erred in its first step out of the gate, the mental disposition of the theologian. Theological methodology necessitates specific presuppositions due to the nature of its object of study. Unlike the natural sciences, where the scientist proceeds by gathering together a series of individual observations through which the scientist eventually comes to the knowledge of the object of study, theology begins with its object and then moves to the consideration of individual parts. Theology proceeds, or should proceed, Vilmar thinks, from the total, entire knowledge of the full personality of the living God. And it moves, or should move, toward the total, complete personality of mankind. It does not proceed from individual acts and revelations of God, but from the eternal, entire, and total personality of God. Theology presupposes that the theologian already has a knowledge of God, instead of seeking to come to knowledge after inquiry. Therefore, in Vilmar's estimation, theology was not a study comprised of inquiries of an unknown object, whose conclusions result in the accusation of new knowledge and insight. From its requisite mental disposition that spurns all presuppositions, to its inductive methodology, and a spirit of research driven by a desire for novelty, welcome to the modern theological academy, Vilmar repudiated the entire project of theological science. In other words, Vilmar rejected the entire theological project of 19th century German universities. In fact, he went so far as to advise that theology stop classifying itself as a science. What I would happily prepare the way, but I cannot achieve, in well-intentioned and sympathetic circles, is that on our side we dispense toying with the word science. Theology belonged to and was determined by and served not the university, but the church. It was not the product of the university. Vilmar went as far as to argue that it was an error to attempt to define faith as knowledge. Knowledge, Wissen, was restricted to the appearance that one receives through empirical observation. On the other hand, faith speaks to a kind of cognition that is living, that transpires through the absorption of the essence of the object into its subject. In contrast to theologies of rhetoric, Vilmar believed that true theology concerned itself with the living God, and it sought pastoral formation for the purpose of parish ministry. Schleiermacher believed the same thing as well. In theology, should be given and receive the word of God, the certainty, the undoubted, unimpeachable certainty of eternal life of salvation. Theology must exercise the office of shepherd in such manner that it instructs the coming generation toward becoming a generation of true shepherds, able and ready to gather the sheep, to go after, to seek and find them. Whoever has not given exclusive attention to educating pastors is no teacher of theology. Theology is not primarily academic talk that emerges from theologians within a university. Instead, theology is the talking, but not just of God, but from God. The knowledge of God, which calls itself theology, is at the same time a speaking from God, and a speaking from God that goes forth into the world, into human life. Vilmar understood theology to be a divine act, a divine speaking, and as such, it was incompatible with any conception of science determined by the natural sciences. In contrast to this theology of rhetoric, which occupied itself with theories and methodologies, Vilmar advanced a theological system that he called a theology of facts. The word for fact, Tatsache, was a relatively new German word used to translate the English phrase matter of fact. Through the combination of the words tat, deed, act, or something done, and Sache, thing, object, matter. Vilmar employed this word Tatsache in order to refer to a fact of reality that bridges the gulf that separates the past and the present. I think he has this in mind, Lessing and Lessing's broad, ugly ditch. Tatsache carried a historical character, and yet the event, not restricted by Lessing's ugly ditch, extends into the present. A Tatsache exists not merely as a datum of the past that one might believe had happened at a previous point in time. Instead, through its transhistorical character, a Tatsache enters into the present so that the observer might experience it. Remember just a moment ago when I said Vilmar says theology is not knowledge. Faith is not knowledge. It is, theology is not a vista, a knowledge. Theology is faith, and faith is experiential. And this is now we're going to see what he believes actually theology is. For Vilmar, the term Tatsache is not only rhetorical flourish in order to further undermine this theology of rhetoric. He's not just playing word games here. He's making a substantial argument. He's constructing a theology grounded on the concept of fact, that Vilmar sought to advance a system that was divinely structured, but not speculative, historically oriented without a historical reductionism, and personal in character without succumbing to subjectivism. Vilmar maintained that the divine Tatsachen were objective historical facts that had to be subjectively experienced by the believer, whose center is the redeeming, living Christ. Faith was the point of contact between the objective Tatsachen and the believer. The experiential character of the divine Tatsachen meant that the believer underwent a personal participation in the very same Tatsachen. This experience shaped the entire self-consciousness of the individual. Vilmar writes, "In this respect, our faith is an experience, and indeed, it is such an experience which constitutes a part of our self-consciousness. We must grasp this faith not only as one experience in general, but rather as the experience preeminent, from which all other experiences are dependent and determined. It is not only a part of our self-consciousness, but rather we must understand it as the essential content of our self-conscious, through which all of our mental activities, thought as well as volition, are determined in all of the various gradations." For Vilmar, in its highest degree, faith is experience, mediating Christ to the individual, conforming the individual to the work of the divine Tatsachen. Vilmar defined experience as, quote, "a knowing which is reached through me wholly, personally being present there through my whole personal presence." In this way, theology is not only a matter of intellectual comprehension or assent. Theology demands a personal participation on the part of the theologian. Such proposition dismissed by theologians like David Friedrich Strauss and other 19th century German Lutherans. Vilmar employed Tatsachen as the source for dogmatics, but drawing upon the unique constitution of them, he distinguished between an objective and a subjective source for dogmatics. The former, the objective, is the divine revelation of God in Jesus Christ, while the latter, the subjective, is the experience, the personal participation in those very Tatsachen, that is to say, in the redeeming, living Christ. This objective and subjective source for dogmatics creates space for Vilmar to construct a theology that enabled him to attend to certain features of contemporary theology, while still rejecting the body of modern theology. This is what I think is interesting. Given Vilmar's staunch opposition to modern theology, his insistence on the experiential source of dogmatics and the experiential character of theology appears slightly out of character, or even evidences an internal inconsistency within his own theology. And this is what I think is fascinating about him. We would think perhaps he would recourse to repristination, but he doesn't quite. His theology is not constructed merely in contradistinction to the larger trends of modern theology, or simply as a retrieval of a bygone orthodoxy. Vilmar's thought was the product of his own theological journey, resulting in a theological amalgam drawn from his reading of earlier theological sources, both patristic and Lutheran, but also in conversation with contemporary philosophy and contemporary theology. For Vilmar's understanding of experience, two figures were paramount. One you probably like, the other one you probably don't. Friedrich Schleiermacher and Luther. Vilmar saw that in Schleiermacher, in his establishing feeling, Gefühl, as a source of all piety, that he had provided a basis for theology that attempted to circumvent the rationalistic critiques that subjected Christianity to unyielding scrutinies of history, while also avoiding transforming the essence of Christianity into mere propositional knowledge or morality. In his elevation of feeling over rationality and morality, and his attempt to ground Christianity in the person of Christ, Vilmar believed that Schleiermacher was a pioneer for the return of faith. But Schleiermacher was not enough. In his elevation of feeling, Schleiermacher's theology was reduced to his subjectivity. Schleiermacher's theology was limited to the realm of the self and the context of the natural order. But this is where he draws from Luther. Vilmar stated that Luther's single greatest contribution to Christianity was his understanding of the essentially experiential character of sin. He writes, "Since Augustine, even since the time of the apostles up to the present day, among all humanity, Luther hath the truest, corresponding to revelation in the most acute way, the truest and deepest and most vigorous consciousness of sin. In everything Luther penned and wrote, the account of Luther's own experience of sin and grace held the greatest significance for the church, according to Vilmar. In this way, Luther illustrated the appropriation of the redemption from sin and from eternal death, which Christ, through his death on the cross and resurrection, has bestowed upon the world by means of faith." More than anyone else in the history of Christianity, Vilmar believed that Luther experienced the personal gravity of his own sin, which led him to his experience of the personal closeness of the Christ who redeems from sin. In this way, Luther's experience transcended the circumscribed boundaries of simple individualistic experience. Luther experienced nothing less than the reality of the chief article of the church's confession, namely justification, the experience of which is foundational for all of the church's experiences. In Luther, Vilmar saw the way that experiences become the vehicle through which theology grasps and shapes the entire life of an individual. For this reason, Luther was more than Vilmar's instructor in faith. Luther was the model to which Vilmar sought to subordinate his own testimony and the mentor whose own experience he desired to relieve. I am almost there. I'll go a little faster. But what must always be underscored in this theology of experience is that Vilmar stressed that the object of the individual's personal experience was nothing but the experience of the church, which must be relived and re-experienced throughout the church's history. The experiences that the individual undergoes transpire within the context of the church and are shaped by this ecclesial context. Experiences belong to an individual, yes, but whatever a person experiences are that of the church. He writes, "The dogmatician has not only his experiences, but rather he has to bring into account the experiences of the Christian church, from which his own are only a result and a part." This was how Vilmar understood Luther. In Vilmar's reading of Luther, although the experience of sin and salvation was by nature personal, it was not individualistic. Luther did not employ his individual experience as a tool that made all theology into a solipsistic enterprise. According to Vilmar, this is what distinguished Luther from the later expressions of pietism that claimed Luther as their inspiration. Unlike the pietists, which according to Vilmar, reduced theology and the very nature of the church's identity to nothing more than the world of feeling of individual pietistic experiences, Vilmar argued that Luther's experiences were, quote, bound to the testimony of the church, integrated into the total experience of the Christian congregation, and finally, subjected under the divinely proclaimed facts of the gospel. For Vilmar, even though Luther's experiences were intimately personal and were reflective of his own biography, they were wholly ecclesial. They emerged from the context of this Christian life of experience. While pietism had rightly sought to reignite the vital nature of the living witness of personal experience, which Vilmar believed was lost during the age of the so-called dead Orthodox period, pietism erred in evaluating the ecclesial context of experience as superficial and disposable. Pietism had recognized the experiential character of faith, but divorced individual feeling from the organic whole of Christianity. In Vilmar's reading of history, this dismissal of the ecclesial context of experience resulted in the demise of dogmatics and helped birth the theology of the Enlightenment. I will move to my conclusion. on this topic, I want to end, before I come to my final words, with this great quote from Vilmar on how he explicates the doctrine of justification as something which is experienced. He writes, "The certainty of eternal salvation is no doctrine, but rather an experience, and thus even the formulation of this certainty, justification alone through faith, in the first place must be identified as an experience, and only a doctrine in a dogmatic relationship. In order to reach the certainty of salvation, to these indispensably belong the same conditions, as the same are implicitly but essentially contained in the sacrament of baptism. That is, to recognize sin and to have tasted eternal death in this sin, but simultaneously to see Christ, the whole crucified and resurrected Christ, as the solace for sin and eternal death, to surrender oneself completely to him, to receive him, to embrace and incorporate him completely as he gives himself to us. For this reason, one can even say the doctrine of justification by faith is no doctrine, but rather a discipline. Properly speaking, the doctrine of justification may not be taught as one teaches some historical or mathematical proposition. Rather, one only witnesses to justification. Justification can only be transplanted from a soul that has experienced justification and then led into another soul as an experience. It is good enough that we have the pure doctrine, but pure doctrine as such is still far from also belonging to a pure witness. We are not merely pointing to the tradition of the correct and pure doctrine as the old stiff dogmaticians thought, but rather we even are especially witnesses to the tradition. The goal of Vilmar's theology, through his interweaving of Christ, revelation, doctrine, history, the church, and the individual, was to arrive at a point where an individual, through ecclesial experience, has a personal and transformative encounter with the incarnate, crucified, and living Christ. Within this experience, there is a realization of one's sinfulness through the confrontation with God's law, and a personal and regenerative encounter with Christ. The entirety of this personal experience corresponds to the doctrine of justification by faith, but it is further inclusive of the whole scope of Christian doctrine. So to conclude, why Vilmar? Well, I believe that there are many things that should commend Vilmar to our study, that should entice us to recognize him as our father in the faith. But what I find inspiring about Vilmar, something that I hold has been neglected, is his uncomfortable fit with the entirety of the theological landscape. Clearly, he was no representative of rationalistic or mediating theology a la Schleiermacher. Vilmar despised and denounced modern academic theology. He recognized that theology is more than an academic enterprise. He was willing to endure criticism and the objections of the theological academy. Vilmar helped recover the living, Christological, and sacramental center of theology. However, we cannot simply label Vilmar as a theologian of predestination. Vilmar did more than merely return to the text of the past. He put these theologians into conversation with the present, and whether he knew it or not, he himself was also shaped by the theologies and philosophies of his day. But he saw that theology and orthodoxy and the past can be in conversation with the present. And that, I think, is something that we can still learn from. That wraps up the first paper.
Are there any questions you'd like to address to Dr. Lee?
You used what were your main sources?
Well, really the only Bible, there's only one, as you know, real biography of him. Paul has his 2-volume one, as you know, but he's also got a number of other little articles. And then there's been some more recent scholarship on Vilmar, but nothing as a complete biography. There's been some interesting studies about his relationship to 1830 and the Augustana. I can send you the citations if you want. I just don't know the authors off the top of my head, but they're in my footnotes.
I think I didn't read much of that biography, but I think too he said that, and this speaks to me now. He mentioned that his experience as a school teacher shaped his understanding of the Testament because he saw he had to deal with children on a day-to-day basis. That's what I know.
What I haven't read, he's got these whole collection of writings from the time of the Gymnasium. I can't remember the name of them, but years of them, and I I've not looked into them. But they're kind of meditations on theology, but also on the modern culture.
I think like questions of the time or something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
He talks about like pedagogy too, be of interest to classical pedagogues, I think.
Yeah, he was also a linguist. That's what he was kind of known for.
Did you use like mainly dig into that his dogmatics text for the quotes on experience?
Yeah, dogmatics, and then he's also got there's this interesting little article from Rückfall zu Römische Kirche and some other odd and end little things, and then there's a 2-volume or a 2-piece essay about him and his relation to Luther. That's really interesting. It's a little dated, but nothing has been done subsequent to it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I found interesting your comments about his working against the scientific theology. And my experience at seminary and reading around is, well, we're scientific theologians, and that's the way we are. And I found it, well, one, their definition of scientific theologian is light years away from the definition of science as science.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you would ask physics what a scientist is, what a theologian would call science is not there. And so I just found it, 100 years ago they're talking about science and theology are not the same thing, and yet, to me, it's that message hasn't gotten around very much.
You know, I don't know. The seminaries, I don't think, talk about theology as a science, not in any modern day of the word, sense of the word. And in German culture, it's still, theology is still Wissenschaft. I don't know what modern German theology means by Wissenschaft. What's the standard by which they understand it? I think the more interesting question is, what place does theology have in the university? Should theology be taught in universities? And that was a question that they were going through at this time. I teach at a university, and we're a little bit different because we're a Lutheran university and a Christian university. What does that mean, right? But so in that sense, theology being taught there. But 20th century is basically witnessed to the demise of theology at universities, right? That it couldn't hold. What do you have in universities now? You don't have theology faculties. You have religious studies, right? And now, you go to the American Academy of Religion, and that's far and away very different than anything that was going on in the 19th century in terms of theology. So I think, in one sense, Vilmar was correct. Theology couldn't maintain its place in the university. Maybe that wasn't theology's fault, but theology could not keep up with the definition of science, and so theology's left. So, and that's exactly what modern religious studies is, right? You study it from an objective, dispassionate point of view. You don't study Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or whatever as a practitioner. You study it as a historian, as an anthropologist, as a studier, as a practitioner of cultural artifacts. You don't study it as someone of faith.
And that empties it of its entire concept. Teaching religious studies. I have no problem with an Islamic person being Islamic. I have no problem with the Greek being Greek Orthodox. But if one is above all of that and immune to all of that, to me one is actually dehumanizing himself.
There's potentially a question in all of this of the status or the stature of a university in a republic. And maybe this is a little out there, but you mentioned that he was a monarchist. I find that interesting because one of the questions that, one of the conditions for this fracturing of knowledge and modernity is how do you transpose the medieval university from the integrated, the fully integrated society, and something which is essentially if not purely feudal, but certainly from a formalist system, let's put it that way, of high Middle Ages, the medieval university, the church and the state, and this concert of enterprise and the faith and the philosophical enterprise being sort of at least in tandem, and that's part of the aegis of the university as such. And then you get to this modern era of the rise of the republic, and where the university figures in there in a place which is especially supposed to be non-sectarian. I mean, that's America. Germany has its own things going on at the same time in the 19th century. But I'm not sure if there's a question here. It just occurred to me, he's a monarchist. He has a vision of the unity of society in a way that maybe some of his contemporaries don't. Does that ever come to bear on his discussion of how theology fits in the university, where the university fits in generally in society?
What I have not found with Vilmar is his understanding of the university as a whole. I also worked with one of Vilmar's peers, Johannes von Hoffman, and von Hoffman is pretty progressive from our perspective in some ways. He's got similar critiques about the place of theology within the university, but for him, this whole period, the university is transforming, right? Because the rise of the research university happens in 1810, the foundation of the University of Berlin. And so what did university become known for? Research. But also at the same time, at least at the early 19th century, under German idealism, universities still had a social goal through education and research of transforming society, through Bildung. That Bildung would transform the German people. And I don't know about outside of Germany, I only look at Germany. But then by the 1840s and 50s and 60s, with the rise of the natural sciences and Pearson taking over, well, some of the early empiricists, today we make the critique like scientism, right? It's almost like a religion. But you look at some of them, they did think it was religion. They honestly said science was going to replace religion, and it was going to transform society. And so I think they still had the university, now driven by the natural sciences, would transform society. So going back to Vilmar, though, I don't know what his vision of a university would be. So I can't speak to that.
Sure.
I don't even want to speculate, because I think I would be swimming in the waters that I don't.
Separate line of inquiry, but it'd be an interesting question.
This understanding of the subjective experience as a source for dogmatics, and also not just the experience of the individual, but the experience over the church through the ages. It seems to me like that leads you to some sort of understanding of progressive revelation.
Development.
Yeah.
And he believes in it. He believes that there's a doctrinal development. And this is something that sets him apart completely from, say, Walther, right? This was something, Walther and the Missouri line completely rejected any idea of doctrinal development. Vilmar follows Kleefot's early 1839 writing on doctrinal development and sees that there are kind of 4 periods of doctrinal development. The first period is Trinitarian and Christological. The second period deals with anthropology, sin. The third period is grace. That's the Reformation. And he says, in our day, the doctrines that still need to be further developed. For him, development he's coming out of idealism, but also romanticism. It's a growing, it's a tree, it's the acorn that sprouts into an acorn tree. It's the church and eschatology. He says these are the ideas that we need to, so for him, through experience, there's a whole section I cut out. He says that in church history, you have certain individuals, Augustine, Athanasius, Luther, who are specifically, he doesn't say chosen, but we see that in them and their wrestling, doctrine is further articulated. It comes to a better articulation. So, yeah, our tradition has a very hard time with that. From Walther. So.
He also, I think, has reservations about the perspicuity of Scripture.
Yeah, and he also deals with inspiration in a different way as well. So I haven't spent a lot of time there.
Thank you for your paper. As you were presenting, I was thinking you were talking about objective versus subjective. And in at least my experience over many years in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, probably up until the early 1960s, if you were to visit a congregation during the public examination of the confirmands, it was just rote knowledge that was being asked. You know, the pastor would ask, I don't know how many of us went through that, but you know, you had to do your memory work in front of the congregation. You had to answer questions, all objective, very objective. Now, it seems the pendulum has swung so that if you visit a lot of congregations these days, the junior confirmands have written their personal faith statement, which and so I think that the pendulum there has swung, the objective fact. We get these young people into confirmation class, and all we need to do is top them off a little bit. We've got to fill up their minds with the facts, what was that, dragnet, just the facts now. And yet, Vilmar said that's not enough. It's got to be, the objective has to be experienced, to be subjective. So a statement that comes to mind, and see if this would characterize him. To be a good Christian depends not only on how much you know, but on how deeply you feel. Not only on how much you know, but on how deeply you feel. Because if you don't know anything, if there's no objective, if there are no facts, then what do you base your faith on? Faith development.
But I think something that's important to get with Vilmar is that feeling for him is transformative.
Right.
That it's not an isolated feeling, which is what our day and age is. It's the experience of the church which an individual has, and it transforms them. It forms them. And when you read Luther, I'm not a scholar of Lutheran Orthodoxy, but Gerhard talks about the different kinds of knowledge and the different kinds of faith, and that there's love. So I think there's a complete, I don't want to say complete correspondence, but in one sense, Vilmar's not arguing anything completely new, but he is reading it and interpreting it in a way, in lenses that have been formed by idealism and romanticism. So.
I'm curious, because I think from Descartes on, when you seek to talk about religion, you say that, yes, objectively I will look at this with, dispassionately. But then they say privately I hold this, and the Enlightenment is sort of predicated on a sharp distinction between private and public. I'm curious, because a lot of people in the sort of Moses Mendelssohn sort of line of thought, even Kant, would say, oh sure, take theology out of the universities, it's just private, in a sense doesn't have to speak to society or anything. Does his understanding of the church growing in the world or shaping society, does he have a concept of that, where it wouldn't, well, not in the university per se, but it still speaks or has a ruling element in society?
I haven't gotten too much into his relationship of where church fits into society, but there are a couple of quotes where he believed Vilmar, that the office of the ministry was going to be the means by which God, I'm paraphrasing from bad memory, so I'm recalling bad memory and paraphrasing, transform society, and it was the ministry that was going to, God was going to use the the office of the ministry to accomplish this. I don't know how or what that looked like, so.
Right.
It's Kiliasm to it. That's one of the things you mentioned we're not supposed to like. I don't like that one.
But a lot of them were.
Yeah,
Oh,
but
like
that-
David.
this transformation of society,
Yeah.
I mean, that's, broadly speaking, Kiliasm, a crescendo toward the second coming, but.
That's just, yeah.
Well, perhaps we should take 10 minutes and give